I sat in that lawyer's office, fully expecting to split everything evenly, just as our mother had always promised, just as she had always reassured me throughout the years, just as I had believed without question, because I never imagined that my own family would turn against me over something as trivial as money. I wasn't expecting a fight, wasn't expecting a betrayal, wasn't expecting anything other than a simple division of assets that reflected the fairness she had always preached. But the moment I saw the smug curve of my brother Ethan's lips, the way he leaned back in his chair with that easy, self-satisfied confidence, I knew, before the lawyer even spoke, before a single document was read aloud, before the final words were signed and sealed, I had been played. The air in the office was thick with the smell of old books and polished wood, the kind of sterile professionalism that was meant to make everything feel official, binding, inarguable, but all it did was make the betrayal feel heavier, make the words land harder, make the realization sink deeper. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the kind of detached efficiency that only comes from years of delivering bad news, cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading from the will, his voice steady, emotionless, the words flowing over me like a slow, creeping flood I couldn't stop. To my son, Ethan, I leave the house, all remaining financial assets, and full control over the estate. That was it. That was the moment everything I had believed about fairness, about family, about trust shattered into something unrecognizable, something cold and sharp that settled in my chest like a stone. I blinked, barely breathing, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I had just heard, my pulse thundering in my ears as I turned to look at Ethan, searching his face for some kind of explanation, some kind of acknowledgement that this was a mistake, that something had gone wrong, that this wasn't what was supposed to happen. But all I found was that same infuriating smirk, that same unbearable smugness, that same expression I had seen 1,000 times before when we were kids, and he had taken something from me just because he could, just because he knew no one would stop him. Are you kidding me? The words slipped out before I could stop them, my voice steadier than I expected, my fingers gripping the armrests of my chair as I tried to keep my composure, tried to hold back the storm of anger rising inside me, tried to remind myself that I wasn't a child anymore, that this wasn't just another sibling rivalry, that this was something real, something permanent, something I couldn't just brush off and walk away from. Ethan let out a short, humorless chuckle, shaking his head like I was the one being ridiculous, like I was the one who had no right to be surprised, like he had expected this outcome all along and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "Oh, come on," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, his voice carrying that same lazy confidence he had always had when he knew he was untouchable.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You don't need it. You don't have a family to take care of, you don't have a mortgage, you don't have kids depending on you. It makes sense for everything to go to me. I actually have responsibilities. I felt the breath leave my lungs, my fingers curling into fists against my lap, my entire body going rigid as the full weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. He wasn't just justifying his theft, wasn't just trying to make himself feel better about what he had done. He was dismissing me, reducing my life, my needs, my worth, to nothing more than an inconvenience, something that didn't matter, because I didn't fit into the traditional mold of what he considered important. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping through his papers as if he wished he were anywhere else, as if he could feel the tension crackling between us, but had no intention of stepping in, no intention of fixing what had already been decided. The will had been signed. The documents were legal. The house, the money, everything that should have been split between us, everything that represented our mother's legacy, everything that had once been ours was now his, and there was nothing I could do about it. I could have fought, could have argued, could have screamed that this wasn't fair, that our mother would never have wanted this, that there had to be some mistake, but I didn't. I didn't let the rage show, didn't give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing me break, didn't let him know that, for one brief moment, I had the overwhelming urge to grab the nearest object and throw it straight at his smug, entitled face. Instead, I took a slow breath, unclenched my fists, and forced a smile that I knew didn't reach my eyes, a small, careful, calculated expression that made Ethan's smirk falter just slightly, just enough to tell me that he wasn't entirely sure what I was thinking, wasn't entirely sure whether or not I was about to make this easy for him. "Fine," I said simply, my voice smooth, steady, utterly unreadable. Ethan blinked, clearly expecting more, clearly waiting for me to argue, to beg, to plead my case like he thought I would, but I didn't give him anything, didn't give him the reaction he wanted, didn't let him know that, beneath the surface, I was already planning my next move. "Fine," he repeated, narrowing his eyes like he thought I was bluffing, like he didn't quite believe that I was really going to just accept this. I stood, smoothing down my shirt, grabbing my purse, giving him one last look that I knew would sit in the back of his mind for weeks, a look that said you think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming. "Go ahead and enjoy it while you can," I said, turning toward the door, walking out without another word, without another glance, without letting him see the way my hands were shaking with barely contained fury. Because if Ethan thought this was over, if he thought I was going to just walk away and let him have everything without consequence, if he thought he had truly won, then he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. I walked out of that lawyer's office without looking back, without giving Ethan the reaction he wanted, without letting him see the way my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my palms as I swallowed down the rage burning in my throat. He thought he had won, thought that because I hadn't fought him right then and there, because I hadn't screamed or cried or demanded justice, that I had simply accepted what he had done, that I was going to slink away quietly and let him take what was supposed to be ours without a fight. But the truth was, I knew better than to fight a battle I wasn't ready to win, knew better than to waste my breath arguing with a man who had spent his entire life believing he was entitled to more simply because he had a wife and children while I, in his eyes, was just the single, disposable sister who didn't need anything. So I let him think he had won. I let him move into the house without a word, let him parade around like he was king of the castle, let him talk about his big plans to renovate, to rip up the floors, to modernize the kitchen, to gut the history out of our childhood home just so he could turn a quick profit. I sat across from him at family dinners, listening to him brag about his house, about how he was going to flip it for way more than Mom had ever paid, about how investing in property was the smartest thing he could have done, as if he had worked for it, as if he had earned it, as if he had done anything other than manipulate a grieving mother into signing over something that was meant to belong to both of us. "I'm thinking of knocking down that wall between the dining room and the kitchen," he said casually one evening, swirling the whiskey in his glass, his tone so disgustingly nonchalant that I had to dig my nails into my leg beneath the table to keep myself from reacting. "Open concept. Buyers love that kind of thing." I nodded, took a sip of my wine, forced a polite smile that I knew would irritate him more than if I had argued. "Sounds smart," I said lightly, like I couldn't care less, like I wasn't already planning a way to make sure he would never get the chance to sell that house for a profit. Ethan smirked, clearly enjoying himself, clearly convinced that I was too weak to do anything about what had happened, that I was simply another woman who didn't understand business, that I was just being a good sport because I had finally accepted my place. But what he didn't know, what he would never see coming, was that I had already started doing my own research, already started making calls, already started looking into exactly how ironclad his claim on the house really was. The thing about property inheritance, the thing that Ethan hadn't considered, the thing that he had assumed was simple, was that laws surrounding estate division were rarely as straightforward as people thought, especially when there had been a history of financial transactions tied to the property. Mom had refinanced the house a few years before she passed, had pulled equity to help Ethan out when he and his wife were going through financial trouble, had taken out a loan against the property with me listed as the secondary guarantor. And that changed everything. Because while Ethan had technically been granted the house in the will, while his name was now on the deed, that loan, the one our mother had taken, the one that still had my name attached to it, meant that the house wasn't entirely his to do with as he pleased. It meant that I still had a legal stake in it, that I had a financial claim that couldn't be ignored, that I had leverage he hadn't even considered because he had been too busy gloating, too busy assuming that being the man of the family meant he automatically got everything. I sat in my car outside my apartment later that night, the the streetlights casting long shadows across the windshield, my laptop balanced on the passenger seat as I scrolled through legal documents, reading and rereading, making notes, searching for the exact loophole that would ensure Ethan's victory, was nothing more than an illusion. I needed to be careful, needed to be smart, needed to move slowly enough that he wouldn't suspect a thing until it was too late, until the trap had already snapped shut around him, until he had already spent every dime on renovations, already sunk himself so deep into debt that by the time he realized what had happened, he would be begging me for a way out. The next morning, I made the first of several quiet, careful phone calls. The first was to the estate attorney, posing as the polite, concerned sister just trying to tie up loose ends, asking very specific questions about financial obligations tied to inherited properties, about what happens when one party still has a legal connection to a home that's been transferred. The second was to the bank, confirming that the loan our mother had taken was still active, still tied to my name, still something that Ethan could not ignore if he ever wanted to officially sell the house. And the third? The third was to a real estate contact I knew would be able to tell me exactly how much trouble Ethan would be in once he tried to cash in on his so-called inheritance and found out that his ownership wasn't as absolute as he thought. I hung up the phone, exhaled slowly, stared at the ceiling, feeling the calm satisfaction of knowing that I had time, that I had leverage, that I had something Ethan could never take from me. Patience. He thought I was backing down. I was just getting started. Ethan wasted no time treating the house like his personal gold mine, walking through it with a clipboard in one hand and a smug grin on his face, talking about tearing down walls, replacing floors, modernizing fixtures, and adding value to something that was never really his to begin with. He acted like a man who had just won the lottery, bragging about his investment, about how real estate was the smartest way to build wealth, about how flipping this house would be the easiest money he ever made. He called in contractors, ordered blueprints, picked out marble countertops, and started ripping apart the home we had grown up in without a second thought, as if the memories that lingered in every corner meant nothing, as if the chipped doorframe where our mother had marked our heights as children was nothing more than another outdated feature to be fixed. I stayed quiet, stayed patient, stayed indifferent, pretending that I had moved on, pretending that it didn't bother me, pretending that I had accepted my place as the loser in this game he thought he had already won. I nodded politely when our relatives brought up his plans, feigned interest when he mentioned design choices, even smiled when he showed me the expensive light fixtures he had splurged on because buyers love high-end finishes. Every time he talked about resale value, about how this neighborhood was about to boom, about how timing was everything, I just let him ramble, let him believe he had outsmarted me, let him keep spending. Because the more money he poured into that house, the deeper he sank into something he didn't even know was quicksand. I had spent weeks combing through every document, searching for the exact moment where Ethan's ownership stopped being so absolute, where his claim on the house became something questionable, something I could legally challenge without him even realizing it was happening. And then, buried in the records, hidden beneath years of paperwork that Ethan had never bothered to read, I found it. The refinance agreement. A few years before she passed, when Mom had decided to help Ethan and his wife with their financial struggles, she had refinanced the house, pulling equity to give them a loan they had promised to pay back but, of course, never did. What Ethan didn't realize, what he had never even considered, was that in the process of restructuring the mortgage, Mom had needed a secondary guarantor, someone to sign alongside her, someone who could ensure the bank that there was another party tied to the debt. And that someone? Me. I sat in my car for a long time after confirming it, staring at the document, rereading the lines that made it crystal clear. Mom may have willed the house to Ethan, but legally, financially, structurally, it wasn't that simple. Because when you inherit a property with outstanding financial obligations, those obligations don't just disappear, and since my name was on that refinance agreement, that meant I had a stake in it. Not just a moral stake, not just an emotional tie, but an actual legal ownership percentage that Ethan had completely ignored. And now I had options. I could have gone straight to him, could have thrown the paperwork in his face, could have demanded my rightful share and watched him lose his mind in real time, but I wasn't interested in demanding anything. No, I wanted Ethan to fall into the hole he had dug for himself, to keep investing, keep spending, keep believing that he was on the brink of making the biggest financial gain of his life. So, I did exactly what he never would have expected. I quietly bought out the remaining stake in the refinance agreement. It wasn't difficult, wasn't some complicated scheme, wasn't even particularly sneaky. The bank was more than happy to let me assume responsibility for the outstanding balance, more than happy to process the transfer, more than happy to issue the updated paperwork that, when finalized, officially tied me to the property in a way Ethan wouldn't be able to ignore forever. I sat on the new documents like a queen holding a winning hand in a high-stakes game of poker, watching from the sidelines as Ethan kept upgrading a house he thought was his, investing thousands of dollars in renovations, throwing every penny he had into making it look pristine for a sale that, unknown to him, would never actually happen.
He had no idea.
Not when he installed brand new hardwood floors. Not when he redid the kitchen with high-end stainless steel appliances. Not when he replaced all the old windows with custom-designed energy-efficient models. And not when he walked me through the nearly finished home, practically glowing with self-satisfaction, explaining in excruciating detail how much he was going to list it for, how quickly it would sell, how much pure profit he was going to make. "I'll be out of here in a few months," he said, grinning as he gestured to the space around him. "Got a buyer lined up already. These kinds of homes? People snatch them up fast." I just smiled, nodding along, pretending to be impressed, pretending to care, pretending that I didn't already know how this story was going to end. "Looks great, Ethan," I said, letting my gaze linger on the sparkling new countertops, the freshly painted walls, the completely remodeled living room that was undoubtedly stunning. He had done an incredible job. Too bad it was all for nothing. Because soon, he'd find out who really owned it. Ethan had always been reckless with money, always acted like every financial decision was just another game, always assumed that no matter what happened, he'd find a way to land on his feet, that someone, whether it was mom, his wife, or even me, would always be there to clean up the mess he left behind. So it didn't surprise me when I found out that, after months of pouring every dime he had into renovations, after stripping the house down to its bones and rebuilding it with the kind of luxury upgrades that screamed overcompensation, he had finally run out of cash. I knew it was coming, had been waiting for it, had been counting on it, because men like Ethan never actually planned ahead, never thought past the next move, never stopped to consider what might happen if the perfect deal they had envisioned didn't go exactly the way they wanted.
But Ethan?
He had a solution, a backup plan, something that, in his mind, was a simple fix to a temporary inconvenience. He would take out a loan against the house, use it as collateral, borrow just enough to finish the last few renovations, just enough to cover the staging costs, just enough to hold him over until the sale went through, and he could walk away richer than ever. To him, it wasn't even a risk, wasn't even a question, wasn't even something he had to think twice about, because, in his mind, this house was his, this investment was his, this inheritance was something that had been handed to him on a silver platter, something he was entitled to cash in on whenever he saw fit. But that was before he walked into the bank and found out the truth. I can only imagine the exact moment he realized something was wrong, the way his arrogant smirk probably faltered just slightly as the loan officer's polite, professional tone shifted into something a little more hesitant, a little more cautious, the way the conversation that should have been routine suddenly turned into a confusing tangle of legal language and unexpected complications. Because when Ethan confidently slid his paperwork across the desk, when he sat there waiting for the approval he was so sure would come without issue, he was hit with something he hadn't seen coming, something he hadn't even considered might be a possibility. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lawson," the loan officer must have said, their voice carefully measured, the kind of neutral, businesslike tone that bankers used when they were delivering bad news. "But we can't process this loan without the signature of the co-owner." I wish I could have seen his face in that exact moment, wish I could have watched as the confusion twisted into frustration, as the words sank in, as he scrambled to process what had just been said, as the reality of the situation finally began to dawn on him. Because in that single sentence, in those few unexpected words, everything he thought he knew about this house, about this inheritance, about his financial future came crashing down around him, leaving nothing but a slow-burning sense of panic he had never felt before. "What do you mean, co-owner?" he must have asked, his voice sharp, his patience already thinning, his entitlement flaring up the way it always did when things didn't go exactly the way he wanted. "There is no co-owner. The house is mine." A pause. A hesitant shuffle of papers. A flicker of sympathy from the bank employee, maybe even a hint of amusement, because they knew what he didn't. They could see exactly where this was going. They were about to be the ones to tell him something that should have been obvious if he had ever bothered to check. According to the deed, there is a shared ownership agreement tied to the refinancing of the home. They must have explained, carefully choosing their words, watching as Ethan's confidence started to unravel right in front of them. "You are listed as the primary owner, but there is another name on the legal documents. We cannot move forward with this loan without their approval." His mind must have raced, must have scrambled for an explanation, must have searched for some kind of loophole, some kind of way to deny what was now sitting in front of him in black and white, but there wasn't one. Because no matter how many times he repeated to himself that the house was his, that Mom left it to him, that he was the one in charge, the reality was something very different. And that was when I got the call. The second I saw his name flash across my phone screen, I had to bite back a smirk, had to swallow down the sheer satisfaction that bubbled up in my chest, had to remind myself to play it cool, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where Ethan finally realized he wasn't in control, the moment where he had to turn to me for answers, where he had to come to me for permission, where he had to acknowledge, whether he wanted to or not, that he hadn't won anything at all. "What the hell is this?" he snapped the second I answered. No greeting, no pleasantries, just raw frustration, just seething confusion, just the sound of a man who had just had the rug pulled out from under him in the most spectacular way. "Why is your name on the deed to my house?" I let the silence stretch between us for a second, let him stew in his own anger, let him feel the weight of what had just happened before I finally responded, my voice light, almost amused, playing into every expectation he had about me being clueless, being weak, being someone who never fought back. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, keeping my satisfaction carefully masked, keeping my voice steady like I was just as confused as he was. "That doesn't make sense. Mom left the house to you, right?" I could practically hear his teeth grinding on the other end of the line, could feel the sheer rage radiating through the phone as he struggled to make sense of it, as he tried to find a way to twist this back into something he could control, as he realized, for the first time in his life, that he had missed something important. "Don't play dumb with me," he growled, his voice dropping into something lower, something almost dangerous, something that told me he was desperate now, that he had no idea what to do next. But that was the thing about people like Ethan, they only panicked when they knew they were losing. And the real fun? The real fun was just beginning. Ethan had always been the kind of person who believed that no problem was ever really a problem, that as long as he kept moving forward, as long as he kept talking, as long as he found the right angle, the right excuse, the right way to twist things in his favor, he could smooth over anything and come out on top. So it wasn't surprising that after the bank shut down his loan request, after he realized that his golden ticket wasn't quite as solid as he had believed, after he felt the first real tremor of panic settle into his bones, he did what he had always done best. He doubled down, pushed forward, convinced himself that there had to be a way out of this. If he couldn't take out a loan, if he couldn't leverage the house for more cash, then the only logical option left was to get rid of it entirely, to find a buyer, to close a sale, to make back everything he had spent before anyone could figure out just how much trouble he was really in. To Ethan, the solution was simple. He would sell the house, walk away with his profit, and never have to think about me, about legal complications, about ownership stakes again. But he had no idea what was coming. I kept my distance, watching quietly from the sidelines, pretending I didn't know what was happening, pretending I wasn't keeping track of his desperate attempts to list the house, pretending I didn't see the rushed open houses, the carefully staged photos, the listings full of exaggerated descriptions meant to lure in buyers who didn't know any better. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he was very motivated to sell, that he was looking to close quickly, that he was willing to negotiate. All of it confirmation that he was scrambling, that he was cutting corners, that he was getting nervous. And then, finally, he found someone. The buyer was an older couple looking for an investment property, someone with cash in hand, someone who had just enough knowledge about real estate to be confident but not enough to dig deeper into the history of the house. They made an offer. Ethan accepted without hesitation, and just like that, the sale was moving forward. Inspections were scheduled, contracts were drawn up, legal teams were engaged, and Ethan, finally feeling like he had dodged a bullet, was back to his old self, back to his smug confidence, back to his I always land on my feet mentality. I can only imagine how he felt walking into that title office on the day of the final signing, how sure he must have been that in just a few hours, everything would be finalized, that he would walk out with a check in hand, that he would never have to think about me or my supposed claim again. He probably straightened his suit, flashed that charming but empty smile, shook hands with the buyers, cracked a few jokes about how quickly this all came together. And then, just as he was reaching for the pen, just as the final papers were placed in front of him, just as he was seconds away from getting exactly what he wanted, someone cleared their throat, and everything came crashing down. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lawson," the title agent must have said, their tone carefully professional, deliberately measured, the kind of voice people use when they know they're about to ruin someone's entire week. "But we have a slight issue with the deed. It appears there's a co-owner listed on the property, and we can't move forward without their approval." Ethan must have gone pale, must have frozen in place for a second before forcing himself to laugh, before shaking his head like this had to be a mistake, before flashing that same, tired smile that had gotten him out of so many other problems before. "That's not possible," he probably said, his voice still mostly steady, still clinging to the belief that this couldn't be real, that there was no way this was actually happening. "The house is mine. I inherited it. I own it outright."
A pause.
The sound of shuffled papers. The title agent probably pushing a neatly printed document across the table, tapping at a specific section, watching as Ethan's face shifted from confusion to something darker, something uglier, something that finally, looked like recognition. According to county records, they continued, unbothered by his unraveling confidence, unmoved by the silent rage beginning to creep into his expression. "There is a shared ownership agreement on file, which means you cannot legally sell this property unless both parties agree to sign off on the transfer." And that was the moment I made my entrance. I waited until the perfect second, waited until I knew the words had fully settled in, waited until Ethan had turned, wide-eyed and furious, just in time to see me walking into the office, just in time to watch me calmly take a seat at the table, just in time to realize that this had never been a mistake, never been an accident, never been something he could talk his way out of. I smiled at him, slow and deliberate, tilting my head slightly as I slid my own set of documents in front of me, tapping my fingers idly against the table as if I had all the time in the world. "Oh, Ethan," I said, my voice dripping with something that wasn't quite amusement but wasn't quite pity either. "Did you really think you could sell a house you don't fully own?" The color drained from his face, his fingers curling against the edge of the table, his shoulders going stiff as his mind scrambled for a way to fix this, for a way to make this go away, for a way to turn this back into something he could control. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, his voice low, his composure slipping by the second, his eyes locked onto me like he was seeing me for the first time. I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hand, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to make sure everyone in that room knew exactly what was happening, just long enough to let Ethan feel the weight of his own miscalculation, just long enough to make sure he understood, without a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't something he could escape. "This was never just about money, Ethan," I said, my voice calm, my expression unreadable. "This was about teaching you a lesson." Ethan had always been the kind of man who believed that no matter how badly he screwed up, no matter how reckless his decisions were, no matter how deep he sank into financial trouble, there would always be a way out, always someone willing to bail him out, always another trick he could pull to keep himself from facing the consequences of his own arrogance. But this time was different. This time, no amount of charm, no amount of manipulation, no amount of last-minute scrambling could undo what had already been set in motion, because for the first time in his life, he had backed himself into a corner that he couldn't talk his way out of. After the sale fell through, After the buyers walked away, without so much as a second glance, after the title agent explained in excruciating detail that without my signature nothing could move forward, Ethan's confidence shattered in a way I had never seen before. His usual cocky smirk had disappeared, replaced with something much more satisfying, something much more real: panic. I could see it in the way his hands clenched against the table, in the way his jaw tightened as he glared at me, in the way his mind raced behind his furious eyes, desperately trying to piece together a way to salvage the situation. But the problem was, there wasn't a way to salvage it, because he had built his entire plan on the assumption that I didn't matter, that I was nothing more than an obstacle to be brushed aside, that I would either give up or cave under the pressure. But I wasn't backing down.
And now
He was out of options. I watched as he burned through every possible escape route, watched as he tried to convince himself that this wasn't that bad, that he could still fix it, that he just needed to be smart about his next move. But no matter which direction he turned, he hit the same roadblock, the same undeniable truth, the same simple fact that had now become his worst nightmare. I owned half of the house, and I had no intention of selling. A few days after the failed sale, I got the first phone call. His voice was strained, forced, carrying the false politeness of a man who knew he had to beg but hated the very thought of it. "We need to talk," he said, as if this was still something he could control, as if this was still a situation he could negotiate his way through. "I've been thinking, and I realize now that we should have handled things differently. Let's work something out." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it, at the way he was already trying to frame this as some mutual misunderstanding, at the way he refused to acknowledge that he had been the one who tried to cut me out, that he had stolen from me, that he had caused every single problem he was now desperately trying to escape from. "Work something out?" I repeated, feigning confusion, keeping my tone deliberately light, letting him hear just how little I cared about whatever half-baked deal he was about to offer. "I'll buy you out," he said quickly, as if he had come up with a brilliant solution, as if he truly believed that I would jump at the chance to let him walk away clean. "I'll pay you for your share, and then we can both move on. I mean, you don't even want the house, right? It's just causing problems for both of us." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to make him squirm before responding. "How much?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be laughable, already knowing that Ethan, in his desperation, would still try to shortchange me, would still try to walk away with more than he deserved. 50,000, he said without hesitation, his voice steadier now, like he thought he had just made me an incredibly generous offer. And that was when I did laugh. 50,000? I repeated, shaking my head, barely able to contain my amusement. "Ethan, you just tried to sell the house for over 400 grand, and you think I'm going to sell my share for 50? His patience snapped instantly, the false friendliness vanishing in an instant, replaced with raw, bitter anger. "It's better than nothing," he snapped, his voice tight, his frustration leaking through every word. "You're not going to do anything with the house. You don't even live in it. Just take the money and stop being difficult." I smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that sent a sharp reminder through his thick skull that I wasn't some fool he could manipulate, that I wasn't the same naive sister he had dismissed so easily before. "No," I said simply, my tone final, my decision already made. His breath came out in a sharp exhale, his control slipping, his desperation clawing at the edges of his voice. "Then what the hell do you want?" he demanded, his words almost a growl, his patience completely gone. "I want you to lose," I said softly, letting the words sink in, letting him feel them, letting him understand, fully and completely, that this wasn't just about money for me. This was about justice, about fairness, about making sure he never got to walk away from this without consequences. And then, just as expected, the final blow came. A week later, I heard through the grapevine, Ethan had defaulted on a private loan he had taken out months ago, one that he had been counting on paying off once he sold the house, one that had been his last financial lifeline.
And now?
Now the bank was getting involved. Now foreclosure proceedings were starting. Now he wasn't just losing the house, he was losing everything. He stole from me, thinking he could take it all. But now, he was the one about to lose everything. Ethan had always carried himself like a man who believed he was untouchable, like someone who had never truly faced the consequences of his actions, like someone who had spent his entire life assuming that no matter what mistakes he made, no matter how reckless or selfish he was, someone else would always be there to fix things for him. He had spent years coasting on that privilege, treating life like a game where the rules didn't apply to him, convincing himself that he was always the smartest person in the room, that he could talk his way out of anything, that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage.
But now?
Now there was no one left to save him, no safety net waiting to catch him, no last-minute escape that would allow him to walk away unscathed. And for the first time in his life, he had to face the reality of what it felt like to lose. The foreclosure proceedings had moved faster than he expected, faster than he had time to prepare for, faster than he had even realized was possible, and by the time he truly understood the gravity of his situation, it was already too late. The bank had given him final warnings, had sent the official notices, had made it clear that without an immediate financial solution, the house he had poured everything into, the house he had stolen from me, the house he had once bragged would make him rich, would no longer be his at all. And because he was still legally tied to me, because his name wasn't the only one on the deed, because he had been too arrogant to check the fine print before assuming he had full control, his options were even fewer than he realized. He couldn't sell without me, couldn't refinance without me, couldn't fix this without me. And that was how, for the first time in his life, my brother was forced to beg. The phone call came late in the evening, just as I was settling into my apartment with a glass of wine, just as I was enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this was the moment I had been waiting for. His name flashed across my screen, but I didn't answer right away, didn't give him the immediate attention he was undoubtedly used to, didn't let him think that just because he was desperate, I would drop everything for him. I let it ring twice, 3 times, before finally picking up, pressing the phone to my ear, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "What do you want, Ethan?" I asked, as if I didn't already know, as if I hadn't been anticipating this exact moment, as if I hadn't been waiting to hear just how much his voice would shake when he realized he had no power left. "I need your help," he said, and for the first time, there was no arrogance, no condescension, no false confidence trying to mask his desperation. His voice was raw, uneven, the voice of a man who was drowning and knew it.
Please.
I let the silence stretch between us for a moment, let him sit in the weight of his own downfall, let him feel just how little I cared about making this easy for him. "That's funny," I said finally, swirling my wine in my glass, "because the last time I checked, you were the one who said I didn't need the house. But now, suddenly, I'm the only person who can save you." He let out a sharp breath, something like frustration mixing with the clear, undeniable panic creeping into his tone. "Look, I know I screwed up," he said, forcing the words out like they physically pained him, like he was only saying them because he had no other choice. "I should have handled things differently. I should have." "You should have what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper now, my patience running thin. "Been fair? Treated me like an actual equal? Not stolen from me." Silence. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, not bothering to hide the amusement in my voice when I finally spoke again. "Ethan, let's skip the part where you pretend this is about regret. You don't feel bad about what you did. You feel bad that it didn't work out for you." He was silent for a long time after that, long enough that I could almost picture him sitting there, running his hands through his hair, realizing that every possible excuse he had rehearsed in his mind wouldn't work, that every version of this conversation where he convinced me to just be reasonable was already dead before it even started. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice low, defeated, exhausted. And that was when I made my final move. "I want the house," I said simply, letting the words settle, letting them sink into his mind, letting him feel just how completely and utterly he had lost. He laughed, but it was bitter, sharp, desperate. "I can't just give it to you," he said, as if he still had any leverage, as if this was still something he could negotiate. "You don't have a choice," I reminded him, keeping my voice cool, even entirely detached. "The bank is taking it. You can let them, or you can sell your share to me before that happens." Either way, you're losing it. Another long silence, another breath of hesitation, another realization settling over him like a weight he couldn't shake. He didn't want to agree, didn't want to admit defeat, didn't want to hand over something he had once believed was his, but he knew he had no other option. How much? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, taking another sip of wine, savoring the taste of victory before delivering the final blow. 100,000, I said smoothly, knowing it was a fraction of what the house was actually worth, knowing it was an insult to the money he had poured into renovations, knowing it was just low enough that he would hate himself for agreeing to it, but just high enough that he couldn't afford to say no. He cursed under his breath, muttered something about how I was screwing him over, about how I was just as bad as him, about how this wasn't fair, but in the end, he said yes. And just like that, the house was mine. I finalized the paperwork the next day, signed the documents, transferred the funds, and watched as Ethan officially removed his name from the deed, his shoulders hunched in defeat, his face pale with the realization that everything he had done, everything he had fought for, everything he had stolen from me had all been for nothing. As he stood there, staring at me, his expression unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, I gave him one last, final, satisfied smile. Ethan, I said, tilting my head slightly, my voice soft, steady, utterly victorious. You were right about one thing. I didn't need the house. I just needed you to know it was never yours. Ethan didn't say much the day he left the house, didn't make a scene, didn't throw one last tantrum, didn't try to argue his way into another opportunity to make things right on his terms. He simply packed up what little he had left, loaded the last of his belongings into a half-empty moving truck, and stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the house like he still couldn't quite believe it was no longer his. I watched from the driveway, arms crossed over my chest, waiting to see if he'd say something, waiting to see if he'd try to justify everything one last time, waiting to see if he'd try to convince me that after all of this, I should still find a way to let him off the hook. But there was nothing left for him to say, nothing left for him to take, nothing left for him to hold over me. He had stolen this house from me, had ripped it from my hands with smug arrogance, had treated me like I was nothing in the grand equation of his financial success. He had dismissed my existence, had called me less deserving, had assumed I wouldn't fight back, had laughed in my face as he turned our mother's home into his personal real estate project.
And now?
Now he was walking away with nothing to show for it, nothing but debt, nothing but regret, nothing but the slow, agonizing realization that he had destroyed himself with his own greed. He glanced at me once, just briefly, as if searching for something, maybe an opening, maybe a sign that I was feeling merciful, maybe even a sliver of guilt in my expression. But I didn't give him anything, didn't offer him a single word, didn't give him a single moment of comfort, because Ethan had made his choices, had played his game, had lost. And now he had to live with that. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without another word. I stood there, watching as the truck disappeared down the street, waiting until he was nothing more than a speck in the distance, waiting until the last echo of his presence faded into silence before finally turning toward the house, my house. I had spent so much time fighting for this place, had spent months maneuvering, planning, making sure that Ethan fell right into his own trap, making sure that he lost exactly the way he had once expected me to lose. But now that it was truly mine, now that his name was wiped from every legal document, now that there was nothing left connecting him to this home, I finally let myself exhale. I ran my fingers over the front door as I stepped inside, feeling the cool wood beneath my touch, remembering the way Mom used to lean against this very frame, arms crossed, smiling at us whenever we ran up the porch steps after school. I walked through the hallway, past the scuffed floors Ethan had once planned to rip up, past the walls where family photos had once hung before he erased them, past the living room where Mom used to sit with a cup of tea, looking out the window like she was lost in thought. The house had changed under Ethan's hands, had been stripped of its warmth, had been gutted of the things that once made it a home, had been turned into something cold and impersonal, something designed to be sold instead of lived in. But now that he was gone, now that his influence had been erased, I could restore it, could bring it back to what it was always meant to be, could make it mine. I spent the next few months undoing everything he had done, removing the impersonal touches, replacing them with warmth, with color, with life. I hung new curtains, put the family photos back where they belonged, repainted the walls in soft, inviting tones that made the space feel lived in again. I planted flowers in the garden, sat on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee, let the house breathe again, let it become something more than just a bitter reminder of what had been taken from me. And slowly, day by day, it became a home again. Not his home, not our home.
Mine.
Then one evening, just as the last rays of sunlight faded over the horizon, my phone buzzed with a new email. I almost ignored it, almost left it unread, but something in my gut told me to look, told me to see exactly what it was before deleting it like I did with every other half-hearted attempt Ethan had made to reach out in the past few weeks. It was from him. There was no subject line, no long-winded apology, no desperate plea for help, no attempt to rewrite history. Just one sentence. I should have been fair with you. I stared at the words for a long moment, reading them over and over, feeling the weight of them settle in my chest, not as an apology, not as some grand admission of guilt, not as anything that could erase what he had done, but as a simple, quiet acknowledgement of reality. He had lost. He had finally understood. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness, didn't mean he got another chance, didn't mean that after everything, I would ever let him back in. I let out a slow breath, my fingers hovering over the screen for just a second longer before I pressed delete, watching as the message disappeared forever, as his last attempt at closure was erased as easily as he had once tried to erase me from my own inheritance. Maybe in another lifetime, in another world, in another version of this story, where he had been different, where he had chosen fairness over greed, where he had been the brother I once believed he was, I would have responded. Maybe.
But now?
Now it was too late.